Government transparency, it's something all of us want, but how has it been impacted amid the COVID-19 pandemic, not just in Pennsylvania, but throughout the country? Investigative journalist Amanda St. Hilaire joins us to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm your host, Sam Chen. Government transparency, it's something all of us clamor about, but how has it been impacted amid the COVID-19 pandemic? Both the public and members of the media have been raising concerns, not just in Pennsylvania, but across the country. Amanda St. Hilaire, three-time Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist with FOX6 in Milwaukee, as well as the host of the Open Record podcast, joins us today. Amanda, welcome back to Face the Issues. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
First question, before we even get into it, how are you doing? How is your family?
Things are good. It's been an interesting experience being a journalist and turning stories from home while having a one-year-old running around. But we've kind of settled into a little bit of a new normal. So I think things are going about as well as can be expected.
Oh, that's good to hear. I think new normal is kind of the term of the year.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend the other day. He said, I don't think any of us had COVID-19 in our 2020 bingo cards.
No, we did not. And it makes me think about, when you're looking at what the year is going to look like and the kinds of stories you think you're going to cover. I don't think any of us anticipated this kind of shift.
No, I agree. I think the very, very first episode that we launched into the season, I started my intro by listing everything coming down the pike in 2020. And it was the presidential elections, the U.S. Census, the 2020 Olympic Games. And then, of course, when Kobe Bryant passed, that was the defining news moment. And we had no idea what was coming down just a month later. And so it's been crazy. Man, I want to, before we jump into the conversation specifically regarding COVID-19 and its kind of impact on government transparency, I want to start just in general terms so our viewers know what we're talking about. There are a lot of terms that are thrown around when we talk about government transparency, terms like open records, FOIA, right to know. What are these things? Are they different from each other? What are we talking about?
Sure. So when we're talking about public records, we're talking about records that belong to you, to the public. The general principle, whether you're talking about federal or the various state laws, is that you as the people, you're the boss. And these records that document what your government is doing with your money, doing on your time, doing on behalf of you, that's all something that belongs to you, and you should be able to see it because then you can hold your leaders accountable. You can make informed decisions. So when we say FOIA, that's Freedom of Information Act, that's the federal law. So when we're dealing with the federal government, we're talking about FOIA. Pennsylvania's open records law is called the Right to Know law. So when we say right to know, we're referring to Pennsylvania. And then when we're talking about access to open records, public records, these are the receipts. These are the documents that tell you what your government is doing.
And you said earlier that these are public records in the sense that they are public for us, those of us that are in the citizenry. Anyone that lives in this country or lives in that state, they should have access to this. Is that the idea of open records? Like, who are they open to? And can just general members of the public access them? Or is this something where you need to go through your rep or you need to go through a member of the media to access it?
Yeah, the idea is that the presumption is that these records are public and you yourself can access them. Now, there are always restrictions, right? You don't have the right to see someone else's personally identifiable medical information. And Pennsylvania has a whole list of exemptions to the right to know law that you don't have access to. But the presumption is supposed to be that when in doubt, you can see it, and you means anyone. Now, there is a process that you follow. You submit a request. The agency has a certain amount of time to respond to your request and either grant it, deny it, ask for an extension. And there are avenues you can pursue if you are denied a request and you think maybe that should have been granted. But generally speaking, the presumption is supposed to be that anyone can access these records.
And are governments required to comply with open record requests?
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about, every state has its own laws, but it's supposed to be, at least in Pennsylvania, minus the legislature, which has its own set of rules. But everyone else is supposed to be required to at least respond. Sometimes that response is a denial, but you're supposed to respond. And then if the records are public, turn them over. So it's not a matter of, I don't want Amanda St. Hilaire to see this thing we're doing, so we can just say, no, you're not going to get it. Even the stuff you don't want to turn over, you're supposed to need to turn over.
So what constitutes then a public record? So I imagine something, I spent time working in the federal government, and we had a lot of documents that were classified. Even in the Congress, there's a room called SCIF. And when you enter SCIF, you're not allowed to even bring your phone or any electronics in, even if you have the clearance. The idea is that you can't take photographs of any of that. Are those considered public records, or are those not? Are those off limits and requests like that?
So it depends on who you're talking about. I mean, certainly you can request anything you want. It's a question of whether you're going to be able to get it. And when in doubt, request it and see. But public records can include anything from the typical things you might think of, like budgets, expenses, credit card statements, but they also include electronic communications. And especially as things have evolved in that world, there's been a lot of discussion about Facebook messages, any kind of instant messages, or we're seeing those being used a lot as people are working from home, emails. So all of those things, if they're about government business, then a lot of times they're fair game for public records requests.
And generally, I mean, you've been doing this for a while. I know you were here in the Harrisburg area in Pennsylvania. That's actually how I got to know you. You earned a very stellar reputation for, in one sense, being someone that never backed down. I think I joked last time that, if Amanda St. Hilaire is calling or knocking at your door, you better start fessing everything up.
Well, thank you.
But on the other hand, also doing it with just complete class and grace. Everyone I know that worked in the business respected you. And this is coming from the other side of the aisle in my political role. What is in your experience, Amanda, what is the general reason for governments to deny those or even ignore those requests? Why did they do that?
It depends. I've worked with some agencies where it's not necessarily that anything bad is going on. There's just a tendency of secrecy. Sometimes there's a feeling that these are our records, and the reality is they're the public records. The government is just maintaining them, storing them, holding on to them for a little bit. Sometimes there is stuff going on that they don't want people to know about, so you'll see people dragging their feet or really resisting it. But many times in my own experience, when you actually get the records, you go, okay, there wasn't anything bad here, and you wonder what all the fighting about it was about.
And are there situations, or have you had situations where the open records reveal something going on and that leads to perhaps change in legislation or change, or the public begins to use that information to push for change? Has that occurred, and does that occur regularly?
Yeah, that happens all the time. I deal with a lot of public records in my reporting. When I was in Pennsylvania, off the top of my head, we had a situation where there were people who were upset because they felt as though a local police department was favoring one towing company after crashes. So people were being told they couldn't call their own towing company, they had to use this other one, and they were getting charged some pretty high fees. Well, by going through the public records, we could document what was happening, where it was happening, and who it was happening to. And after we aired that report, then those policies changed at the local level. And it may sound like a small thing, but what happens at your local government affects your life way more, in a way more direct way than really anything, most anything at least, that happens on that bigger national level. So these are things that can make a difference. We've gone through emails and investigative reports and found out school districts had long histories of sexual harassment and allowing educators to stay on after verified accusations. When you have the documentation and you can see what's really going on, that's what allows you to hold those leaders accountable. And often it does inspire change.
Yeah. It's good to hear. And you're right. I think Tip O'Neill, the former Speaker of the House in U.S. Congress, always said all politics is local. At the end of the day, change always begins in our localities, not in our nation's capital. Pivoting now, to the COVID-19 pandemic that we all find ourselves in. Like we said earlier, no one predicted this. This was not on any of our bingo cards. What role do you see government transparency playing in the midst of such a crisis? Is it more important? Is there a sense in which we can kind of back off it because our focus is really now moving to the pandemic? Or what's the balance there, if there is one?
I think transparency and the pandemic are linked, and that's why transparency is more important now than ever. From my standpoint as a journalist, I am, of course, applying the reasonable person test, right? So I'm very aware that local governments are operating in a completely different way. You have a lot of people working from home. Access to records can be different. And I think from the requester perspective, you have to be aware of that. At the same time, access to those records is just as crucial, and we should be pushing for that, because knowing how our government is responding, knowing how leaders, why leaders make decisions and who's influencing that is crucial in a time of crisis when those things can slip through the cracks.
Yeah, that's a great point. Amanda, don't go away. I want to continue this conversation. We'll come back. We'll go to break first. Fascinating conversation with Amanda St. Hilaire. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Amanda, thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us. I want to pick up right where we left off, and you're talking about the imperativeness of transparency, especially in times of crisis. And one of the things that I noticed as well is in times of crisis, governments often end up with more power. When there's a disaster emergency or a declaration of emergency or a disaster declaration, governments, especially executive branches, tend to be able to gain a little bit more power to do things that they otherwise may not. And obviously, we all know from Civics 101, checks and balances are what keeps our government in check and really keeps everything flowing. How much do you see, what kind of role do you see transparency, open record playing in a situation like that, as a role in checks and balances, keeping a check on an executive or any government agency when they're gaining more power?
Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head with that, Sam, because if we're not watching, who is, right? So transparency is the avenue through which we can make sure, okay, are our leaders doing what we want them to do and in the way we want them to do it? So an example that pops to mind here in Wisconsin, like many states, there was a COVID-19 response bill that the legislature passed. It was signed into law. The last minute, there was an amendment that gave healthcare providers widespread immunity from civil lawsuits, not just for COVID-19 treatment, but for almost anything that goes wrong through much of July. So by being able to see that and go through and see when was this amendment introduced, who introduced it, what led up to it, and watching that, and then doing a story on that and letting the public know, we're able to give people information that they maybe they're happy about it, or maybe they want to hold their leaders accountable. Either way, you can't take any action on something if you don't know it happened.
Sure. Yeah, we don't know what we don't know. And to your point, I loved how you answered that, Amanda, because it is, our government from its founding has always believed that the ultimate power and authority rests with the people. And if we don't have the resources to utilize that authority, then the government really remains unchecked. I want to ask you specifically a little bit about a few of the things going on in Pennsylvania. You used to work here. You're very familiar with the players here.
Yes.
In Pennsylvania, there's, and in many states across the country, this is not just limited here, Governor Tom Wolf and his administration have come under fire for essentially suspending open records requests. And in Pennsylvania, they specifically deal with a waiver program for small businesses that have been shut down because of the pandemic. They had the opportunity to apply for waivers. Some got them, some didn't. There's been requests made about that process. and about who can get a waiver and who didn't get a waiver, things like that. First question along those lines, is that something that you generally find as reasonable to request with an open records request?
This is not the time to suspend open records requests. The open records requests are not extra. It's not a mere formality or a technicality. It is a crucial part of transparency, which is a crucial part of communication, which is a crucial part of crisis response. So one thing I hear a lot from people who work in government is we can't possibly deal with these requests because we're so focused on responding to COVID-19. Dealing with these requests is part of your response to COVID-19 because people need to see what you're doing. And if you want to communicate, if you want to bring people around to your way of thinking, that's not going to happen without trust. And transparency breeds that trust, even and especially when it's inconvenient for you. Because even if people may not like the information, if you allow them to see it, you've taken away some of those barriers. So I do not believe that this is the time to suspend open records requests. I understand that there may be a conversation to be had about how those requests are answered or the time frame in which they're answered, because again, you do have people who have more limited access to these records now from the government side of things, but to suspend them completely raises a red flag.
Okay. And how do you respond? The governor's response to some of the pressure, he says, and it's a quote here, "I draw a distinction between transparency and following specific rules for things that are mandated that we might not have the capacity to do while we're in this emergency."
Again, your ability to respond to open records requests isn't extra. So if you're saying we're not able to follow these rules that govern transparency, that's essentially saying we're not able to respond to part of this crisis. And I don't think that anyone at home would think that that's an acceptable reaction to this crisis. It's not extra. It's not a formality. And transparency isn't just responding to things when it's convenient or releasing the information you want to release. It's making sure that even when, and especially when it's inconvenient, that the public has access to that information. So just like in any crisis response, we shift resources to where the important areas are. The fact that resources aren't being shifted to this area would lead me to believe that the leaders involved don't see this as a crucial part of their response. And experts in crisis communications that I've spoken to in my own reporting have said that that's a mistake.
And to your point, it's really not a partisan thing where you see the other members of the executive branch are independently elected in Pennsylvania. Our Attorney General, Josh Shapiro, the Auditor General, Eugene DePasquale, and the Treasurer, Joe Trusella, all in the same party as the governor, all executives, but they are actually meeting their requests. And so it's really not a partisan thing either.
And transparency shouldn't be a partisan issue. I think both sides at various points will use it for their own political gains or for their own political purposes. I've certainly seen that in my reporting in Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin. But the whole idea is supposed to be that even if you're not doing anything wrong, you're not doing anything nefarious, the rules exist so that even in the worst case scenario, the public has access, the public has access to information. So, you may not be doing anything wrong, but what about the person who comes after you?
Sure.
If they are trying to cover something up, the door has now been swung wide open to say, in a crisis, we don't need to show this. So I've seen a lot of leaders who have great intentions, but I think there also needs to be a little more thought to what happens down the road when you're gone, when you start making those arguments and setting that kind of precedent.
Sure. I mean, because our government has never been about one person alone.
Right. It's supposed to be set up so that in the worst case scenario, it can still operate and there are still checks and balances, and transparency and the rules governing transparency, those are part of those checks.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Continue on those lines, Amanda, of saying precedent. The other situation has rose in Pennsylvania, and I know it's come up elsewhere as well, is this idea of press conferences. Obviously, we're not doing them in person because of the regulations surrounding COVID-19. But the criticism coming from the media in Pennsylvania to the governor is that the press conferences are not really press conferences. They're not involving any questions. The questions they do take are filtered through a political communications staff, which a lot of my friends, I come from that world, a lot of my friends are in that world and are doing that. But their argument is that they're not really getting to ask questions of the administration that aren't handpicked by the administration. Is this something you're seeing? What's your fear with something like this, or what are your thoughts on something like this, and how do you get around that if you're in the press or in the public?
Yeah, so in Wisconsin, when we do the typical press conference with the Department of Health Services, and the governor will be on that call, the way it works is each media outlet gets one representative, the RSVP, and that representative gets one question, and it's a live question, it's not pre-filtered, but you don't get any follow-ups. So there have been several cases where someone will ask a question, that question will get dodged, or someone will respond, but the information in that response actually won't be 100% right. And the reporter doesn't get to push back on it. It goes on to the next reporter. And you hope that that next reporter will back up the previous reporter, but they also have their questions they're trying to get in. So we've struggled with that in Wisconsin as well. And to an extent, I get the challenges. I mean, some of these calls have more than 100 reporters on them, and you don't have 3 hours every single day to go through and have free-for-all questioning. That said, when you're not able to ask live questions, and it's filtered through someone else, it means that the public isn't able to see their leader's real-time response to those questions. So I know that the Wolf administration has had other opportunities where they have taken live questions, but you don't necessarily get a follow-up. I think if you can do more of those live questions and allow the public to see your real-time response, they're getting to see their leader speak. They're not seeing that filter through someone who works in communications. The follow-up is just as crucial because it's an accountability portion of it. So I have been on press calls that had more than 100 reporters where they said, you know what, we're going to answer questions for 30 minutes. There's a raise your hand feature on a lot of these video teleconferencing apps, and use that, and it'll be as close to a regular press conference as we get. And it means you're competing with other reporters when you're asking the question, but it also allows for the opportunity of follow-up, and it allows for people to answer those questions in real time. And from my own personal experience, those formats have tended to work best and be more consistent with what we would see in a traditional press conference. And I know this probably sounds like inside baseball for a lot of people who haven't been on the press conferences, but I think the reason there's so much pushback is because there is an idea that the public deserves to hear directly from their leaders, and you get to hear that real-time response, which can tell you so much more than an email you get 3 hours later, or the question that they were preparing for because the person who worked in their press office selected it.
I think that's a great point. I mean, at the end of the day, this still is back to the idea that we, the people, hold the authority, and we need to hold our government accountable. And if they are not taking questions or answering questions, we don't have the avenue to do that.
Yeah, and I think there's just a natural inclination when you're told, nope, we're not going to do this, or we're not going to let you see this, or you can't have this. Then people kind of want to see it more. They want to do it more. It raises a red flag. So sometimes it can create a lot of drama where really there didn't have to be any.
No, that's a great point. Amanda, thank you for that. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Amanda, thank you again for your time and for your expertise on this issue. And also I think we really ran through a civics lesson today as well. And so I appreciate that. As you know, we always like to use our last segment to kind of get to know our guests a little more. And as we understand it, you are a new mom.
Yes, I have a 1-year-old.
And time flies. I still remember your tweet when you first became pregnant with your little daughter, and just the excitement of that. I know you grew up in a family of boys.
I have 5 younger brothers, so it's nice to have another girl around. I'll say that.
Yeah. What has it been like being a mom as well as working and in the middle of this pandemic?
It's been a little crazy. I was on the phone with a state representative here in Wisconsin, and one of his first questions was, "How are you doing emotionally?" And it totally threw me off. I wasn't expecting it. It was a very nice question, but you don't really take time, I guess as much time as I should, to sit down and say, where are things right now? Because you're chasing a 1-year-old around, daycare's closed. We're fortunate to have some babysitting, but it doesn't fill in all the gaps. And my husband and I are so incredibly blessed to both have our jobs, which is so fortunate. It also just means it's a whole different thing that we're trying to maneuver and still be productive. In my case, still get good journalism out there that keeps people informed. There's an added pressure to that. And then, of course, my most important role is being a mom and taking care of my daughter. So I'm so fortunate that I am in a workplace that is really understanding of that. A lot of my coworkers are dealing with the same things. They're homeschooling their kids, or I have one coworker who has twin 2-year-olds and a 4-year-old. So that's an entirely different situation. So there is a little bit of camaraderie there around that. And that's really helped through this process.
Good. Man, let me ask you real quick in a few seconds, what's the best part of being a mom?
Oh my gosh. I think the smiles and the giggles are definitely the most instantly rewarding part. One nice thing about being at home is I get to see more of those milestones. So she's walking now, and you see the changes, you see that unconditional love. It's a roller coaster of emotions and responsibility, but it's all worth it. There are a lot of rewarding moments.
No, that's great to hear. Well, Amanda, thank you again for joining us. I appreciate all that you do. Continue up the good work, and we'll have to have you back soon.
Thank you.
So that is all the time we have tonight. My thanks to Amanda St. Hilaire for joining us, and continue this conversation with us online. Just use the hashtag #FaceTheIssues. My name is Sam Chow on behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues. Thank you and good night.